Hi, I'm Dawn Cavanaugh, APQS National Education Director. Today we're going to talk about invisible thread and using it successfully in your long-arm quilting machine. You know, invisible thread has had quite a bad rap throughout the years, and in some cases back in the beginnings of invisible thread, maybe a little bit deservedly so. Keep in mind that when long arms were first moving into the quilting world from the decorator industry or from industry, invisible thread was very common. It was used for hemming draperies, doing upholstery work, or putting together large comforters for hotels and so forth. In fact, huge cones that were made up invisible thread were very commonplace and very, very strong. In fact, some people equated it to fishing line, 10-pound fishing line. Well, definitely this is not what we're going to use in our quilts today. In fact, today's invisible threads are made up of two different kinds of thread, polyester as well as nylon. Both varieties have positives that can affect your quilting depending on what you're trying to do. Now, keep in mind that the invisible thread itself is still not quite invisible. It's either clear or smoke in color. The clear thread, for example, is going to be a little more white or light colored, whereas the smoke thread, on the other hand, will take on a dark shade. Now, the quilt invisible thread can work really great in either the top or the bottom, or in both places. In fact, I'm going to have some fun and show you some of the quilts that I did many years ago when I first got my APQS Longarm. Nobody told me that I couldn't use the invisible thread in either one of those places, so I had lots of fun experimenting. Here's an example of why you might use invisible thread. Well, invisible thread is great for new long-arm quilters who might not quite yet have enough confidence to really dive in and try complicated or complex designs. In fact, that was me over 20 years ago. The very first time I finally got up the courage to do feathers on my quilts, I wasn't 100% positive they were going to look like I expected them to look like. So in fact, I did my very first feathers with invisible thread. So as you can see, you have to get in really close to even see that they're feathers, because I also later learned that I probably should have used batting that had a little bit more loft so those feathers would stand out. But you'll notice that both the feather and the background fill was done with an invisible thread, so they're really not noticeable at all. So it's a great way to camouflage things as you're developing your skills. For example, it's a great way to stitch in the ditch on a particular project, especially when the colors are high in contrast. Let me show you this quilt that I made a few years ago where the colors have lots of contrast. In this case, with my background so light, and then of course the high contrast between the yellow squares and the red and green fabrics, I would have had to have been very, very precise if I were to try and stitch in the ditch with any one of those solid color threads. So instead, I chose to use invisible thread as the way to move from one piece to the other. So even if I happen to wander off just a little bit, the invisible thread helps camouflage any one of those mistakes, and it looks like I am a rock star quilter without a whole lot of effort. Invisible thread is also a great choice when you've got lots of different fabrics going on in a quilt. These two quilts are from my stash that I've made many, many years ago. In fact, if some of you have been in the industry a while, you probably recognize some of those quilts in your stash. Take a look, for example, of this house quilt that I made. It's been hanging on my front door in the springtime for many, many years, so some of the fabrics may have even faded. But that invisible thread has held up year after year. The nice part about it is that as I cross from the dark areas, such as the door on this house, all the way through the light areas and up into the plaids, there is no distraction from thread color, only the beauty of those multiple print fabrics. And on this particular quilt, where the applique has been fused on, the invisible thread allowed me to move from all the different sections, quilting right across the fusible applique from lights to darks without having to worry that I was going to detract from any of those clever pieced Minnesota mosquitoes. Invisible thread in the top and even the bobbin is also my favorite secret weapon when I'm doing specialty techniques. This Christmas vest that I made uses lots of different kinds of braids and ribbon and yarn as a decorative accent across the pieced sections. Every one of those was couched using my Longarm quilting machine and invisible thread in the top and the bottom. I also call it my secret weapon whenever I'm doing metallic thread. You see, some metallic threads work a lot better if the bobbin thread has some elasticity rather than struggling and fighting with that metallic thread that isn't quite as strong a fiber. This particular thread is a flat holographic thread, and I'm not sure the camera will show its glitzy appearance as well as it possibly could. But with invisible thread in the bobbin, the invisible thread has just enough elasticity that as that top thread is passing through the needle, the bobbin thread won't insist that it tugs harder with every single stitch. So as you can see, it makes beautiful stitches, balanced tension, and it's simply a matter of adjusting the tension for both of those two products to work together, which you're going to learn how to do. As I mentioned earlier, invisible thread comes in two typical varieties. One that is a clear color, and a second variety that is smoke or dark color. Of course, it does depend on what shades of fabric you're traveling over, and you may need to audition it to really find out which is the best choice. And just to give you an example of what not to do, I thought I would bring in a quilt that I did many, many years ago when I was first learning to use my Longarm and I used invisible thread. So let's see if I can zoom in enough that you can tell. On my nice navy background on my namesake quilt, I used invisible thread. However, I used the clear variety, so it almost looks like I stitched it with gray thread. Had I been a little more intelligent at that time or known that it existed, I really should have used a smoke or a darker color. You wouldn't even be able to see that thread now. So I learned my lesson that I do have to pay attention to the main fabric shades when I'm choosing my smoke or my clear invisible thread. In addition to coming in two different color variations, invisible thread also comes in two different formulations. One is a polyester thread, and the other, of course, is a nylon thread. We'll see if we can get the camera to focus. There we go, a nylon thread. Choosing the type of invisible thread is really up to each individual quilter. Everybody has a different opinion based on the project they're working on. Personally, for example, I tend to use the invisible nylon thread when I'm going around lots of applique. It's purely a personal opinion, but I prefer the nylon thread because for me it tends to blend in a little bit better as I cross over all of those different colors and textures in the applique piece. It tends to me, not be quite so shiny. However, many quilters prefer the polyester thread, especially when strength or heat tolerance or resistance to yellowing over time is very critical. The main thing is that you evaluate your quilt and take a look at each type of invisible thread and decide, based on the quilt's purpose, what's going to give you the best look that you're after. The keys to successfully working with invisible thread are paying attention to the thread path along with the tension. This particular invisible cone is designed for the thread to exit off the end of the cone. You can tell that because the thread is crisscrossing across the cone itself. That's actually called cross-wound. By contrast, this thread is stack-wound. This thread does not zigzag across the spool. It spirals around in a continuous circle. This spool is best threaded so that the cone itself rotates as the thread is pulled off the spool itself. That prevents it from kinking as it would come off the opposite end, which can cause a major frustration for piecers and quilters with lots of thread breaks. That simple twisting action makes it get caught on all of the thread guides. So first and foremost, make sure you're following the correct thread path based on the type of cone that you're using. For spools that are stack wound, you can try an optional horizontal spool holder that allows you to mount the thread spool all the way forward on your APQS machine. This makes sure that the spool rotates and can allow the thread to go directly straight down to the 3-hole guide right above the tensioner. That helps eliminate all the twisting and snarling that can cause frustration with invisible thread in the first place. When your spool is stack wound and is mounted horizontally, the thread shouldn't really be twisting as it's going through the thread path. And of course, it's going to be coming straight down from the top of the machine. So you can go right through that first hole, and of course, it's a little tougher to see even when you're not doing it for the camera. There we go. And then I'm going to actually skip the second hole and come up in the third hole, if I can find it. There it is. Okay. This allows me to actually change the tension a little bit more and adjust a little more carefully on the tension assembly to make sure that my invisible thread isn't stretching as it goes through. Just as a reminder, no matter how you thread it through these first 2 holes, you must always use the last hole on your 3-hole thread guide. That will ensure that the thread always stays at the deepest angle possible to make sure that it stays firmly seated between the 2 tension discs on your APQS machine. By experimenting a little bit with the thread path here, you can find what works best for the type of invisible thread or the brand that you're using. The most important thing is to be able to adjust the tension, lefty-loosey or righty-tighty, so that our thread behaves just like normal thread, rather than stretching as it pulls through. I'm going to finish threading it up the rest of the way and show you how to test whether there's too much or not enough tension on your invisible thread. Cross-wound cones can definitely be used on the rear spool pin. However, short cones like this can sometimes cause a problem when the thread exits the cone. It might wrap itself around the spool pin itself and tangle it up before it even makes it to the first thread guide. Well, here's a really cool little quick trick. You can simply put some other type of cone directly underneath the one that you're using to raise it up. That will prevent that thread from wrapping itself around the tip of the spool pin and help reduce the chance of snarling and breaking when you use invisible thread. Now, I haven't changed the tension at all from where this particular machine was set for regular quilting thread, but I have used the thread path all the way through the eye of the needle. Here's a way for you to tell if you need to adjust your tension. Well, of course, if you pull the thread and it breaks, you already know the tension is too tight. So turn your tension knob to the left to loosen it. Depending on what thread you were using, you may need to turn it more than 1 rotation to get it loose enough for invisible thread to work properly. When you think you're close, here's how I check. I make sure the thread is coming through the eye of the needle, and then I pull some thread out towards the back of the quilting machine, about a foot or so, and then I let go. Oh gosh, can you see how we've got nice, kinky, curly stretches here? Well, actually, that isn't so nice. That means that the thread is stretching as it's getting pulled through. Once I start moving and that needle starts to bend, it's most definitely going to stretch and more probably break as I quilt. So let's loosen the tension knob and try that again. Okay, not quite such a severe curl, but still some there. One more half turn loose. And one more pull. I can already feel a change in the way that's behaving, and now you can see that the thread has just a soft, gentle wave. That's very close to where I would start doing my test stitching to see if the tension is actually correct with the invisible thread in the top. When you're going to use invisible thread in your bobbin, it does help to pay attention again to that nice tall spool pin on the turbo winder. You may need to put another supporting spool underneath to help prevent the thread from wrapping around the tip. Now, of course, you can also use a thread net around larger invisible thread cones to help make sure that they don't twist or get snarled up as the thread comes off. Personally, I tend to put a piece of batting right in the thread guide directly above the cone itself. The thread does not wrap through the batting. However, the batting pushes down on the thread as it just comes through, and then it travels straight down to the tension assembly here on the bobbin winder. So I'm going to reposition the camera so you can look straight on to see how to tell if you're winding this correctly. Well, it is very hard to see invisible thread, which is why we're using it in the first place. So do take your time to make sure that you've got it correctly threaded through the bobbin winder tensioner. Enter the first top thread guide, then make sure that your thread is actually between the two tension discs on the tensioner assembly itself. In fact, I'm going to turn it a little bit so that you can actually see those two discs. Here they are. Make sure the thread is pinched between them and it hasn't accidentally slipped ahead of the discs or behind them in another part where it could get caught and cause a problem with your winding. Of course, once it's through the top tension guide and the tension discs themselves, the thread will come out and exit the lower thread guide and then move over to the bobbin. To adjust the tension on the winder, rotate the tension knob to the left to loosen and to the right to tighten. To get a preliminary sense as to whether the tension is actually set too tight, you can pull the thread through the guide and the tensioner, just as we did when we threaded the needle, and then let go. I know that it's hard to tell. Let's see if I can get this in front of my hand a little bit here to see it. There we go. We've got just a little bit of curl or a wave, and if you can't see it, trust me, it's a gentle little wave here. It's not kinky and curly like a very tight, overdone hair perm. That's pretty close to okay through the tensioner. Now, of course, our bobbin case tension will need to be checked also. Of course, in addition to having correct adjustment of tension top and bottom, one of the reasons quilters get frustrated with using it into the bobbin is that the thread breaks frequently. Well, that typically happens because a quilter has just wound too much thread on that particular bobbin. If you know anybody who goes fishing, they know that the secret to a well-working rod and reel is to not fill that reel completely full of fishing line. On a small, smart bobbin, you want to shut the bobbin winder off when you've got it just about half full with invisible thread. If you have a big bobbin, you'll want to shut it off when it's just about 1/4 full. That helps to prevent that invisible thread from stretching on itself as it winds and helps to prevent it from slipping into previous wound layers and getting caught as it exits. Once you've learned how to do that, you're going to find that adjusting the tension on the case is very easy. So to do that on your actual winder, while you could adjust the winder pin to shut it off more quickly, the simplest way to do it is, of course, after you have wrapped your thread around the bobbin itself and engage the winder, simply push the lever over as you've watched it when it's just about half full, and that will shut off the winder. I have brought my thread across to the bobbin, and I threaded it from the inside of the bobbin out through the hole that actually latches onto the bobbin winder mechanism so that I can hold on to that thread tail as it begins its winding process. Eventually, when enough thread has wound, I will give it a little tug and that little end will snap off. But for the first several rounds, I'll keep the slack just a little looser so that it doesn't break immediately, forcing me to rethread the bobbin winder. Here we go. I've inserted the bobbin with the invisible thread into the bobbin case and of course threaded it correctly out through the slot under the tension finger and exiting the tension hole on the bobbin case. Well, now to see if I'm anywhere close to the correct tension, I'm going to grab that top thread, hold on to the bobbin case, and pull to see what happens as the thread exits with the pressure the fingers already got on it. Then I'm going to relax my hand to see what happens to the thread. Well, as you can see, as I relax back towards the bobbin case, It is kinking just a little bit, but it's not really tight like a kinky perm. To show you what it might look like if there's too much tension, rather than adjust the screw, I'm going to push down on the tension finger on the outside of the bobbin case, which is the equivalent of tightening up that finger a little bit. So now as I pull, oh gosh, it's so tight I can't even pull it. Let's see if I can get a little more out. There we go. Now as I back it up, you can start to see it really kinking and curling on top of itself. So that would be a sign that once I start sewing, that bobbin thread may break very easily on me. Again, I don't want it to stretch really easily as it's being used. I want it to behave like regular, normal thread. After you've pulled out your invisible thread, if you do find that kinky thread happening there, remember that it's the larger of the two screws on the outside of your bobbin case that you'll adjust. Use a tiny screwdriver and turn that screw counterclockwise or to the left to slightly loosen the pressure on that finger. And of course, turning it to the right will tighten it again. You'll still need to do some test sewing with both your top and your bobbin tension with the invisible thread and make adjustments accordingly, just like you would any other type of thread. That's also true if you're using a different kind of thread in the top or the bobbin, an invisible thread only in one location. To show you how you can check to see whether your starting threads are secured or not, I'm going to use the machine's needle up and down feature to bring my bobbin thread up to the surface of the quilt. I've taken a single stitch and then moved it, and with a little tug I can grab that invisible thread on the bobbin as well. Now I'll move back to the place where I'm beginning. I sure hope that the camera is going to be able to see that invisible thread reflecting in its light. So you can begin by holding the single stitch button in on your APQS machine to take a couple of teeny tiny stitches, not in the same hole ideally. That will let you pull on both of those thread tails a little bit just to make sure there's no slack. However, I know that they're not secured just yet, and here's how you can tell. Separate your two thread tails independently from each other and then pull. If either one of those allows you to keep going, as you can see this one is coming and coming and coming, it means the thread is sliding on itself. So our stitches aren't secure just yet. We need to put more stitches or do back stitching forward and back to make sure that the thread does actually bite and grab hold. So I can hold that button in again, and this time gently and carefully move forward and back ever so slightly to put some tacking stitches in place. I'll stop with the needle up again and try that same trick. I'll separate the thread tails and tug. Oh good, we are tight, and this one is tight too. Both of them are secured. Well, now I can turn on the machine's regulator and go about quilting. When it's time to end your stitching line, do the reverse. Stop the quilting machine and then use that needle up and down feature to control where you place those tacking stitches. You can even rest your hand on the machine if you like to help stay in control. I'm holding the button in and moving back and forth, only going over maybe a couple of threads in my fabric. I'm putting those stitches really close together, just not in the same hole so that I end up breaking my thread. Now I can move the machine away. You can see that top thread is still attached. I can come back to that same spot and take one more stitch. And now as I pull away, I'll be able to tug a little bit and also get my loop of bobbin thread. I know it's really tough to see here on the camera, but I have the bobbin loop in one hand and my top thread in the other. Now all I have to do is snip the threads right there, and both the top and the bobbin thread are cut, and I've secured my stitches at the beginning and ending. Of course, you'll still need to check your tension top and bottom to make sure that you don't need to make any small fine-tuning adjustments. Just like normal thread, if you actually see the bobbin thread or feel it laying flat on the back, it's a sign that the bobbin thread is pulling harder. Either tighten the top tension or loosen the bobbin. And the reverse is true. If your bobbin thread is coming up to the surface, that means your top thread's pulling too tight or the bobbin is not tight enough. Of course, with invisible thread, it's very difficult to see if it's in both places where the problem might be. So try this little trick. Use one fingernail and follow the line of stitching all along as you go. If the thread has made it to the wrong side of the quilt, either the top or the back, your fingernail is going to catch on every little bump or lump that is the wrong thread that's appearing on the surface of the quilt. Whichever side you feel those little bumps on, it tells you that that side is too tight or the opposite side is too loose. And of course, if you end up having some thread breakage, check that your tension isn't too tight. Make sure that your thread path is correct. When using invisible thread, you may be wondering which size needle to actually use. Of course, invisible thread is very, very thin. It's actually 4/1000ths of an inch thick. So a smaller needle is certainly possible to use in your APQS machine. The package on my left shows a size 3.5 or size 16 needle. That works great with invisible threads, which will leave a smaller needle hole behind. However, if you are using other types of threads with the invisible thread, you may still need to use the standard 4.0 or size 18 needle to ensure that the other thread also behaves correctly in your quilting process. Well, if you've been timid about trying invisible thread on your APQS Longarm, hopefully now you're going to have the confidence to give it a try. It's going to help you with many different techniques, including making you look good when you stitch in the ditch, outlining applique, and even doing specialty things like couching and other techniques. Here are two other quick little tips to help make that invisible thread work well for you. You know, because I use it often in the bobbin, I actually use a second bobbin case and leave that particular case set just for invisible thread. In fact, I leave the bobbin that has the invisible thread wound on it resting right inside the bobbin case. That way I don't have to make any changes as I move back and forth between my regular thread and my invisible thread. Here's another good tip to keep in mind. If you find that you start to use it quite regularly or often, every once in a while, take the time to check all of your thread guides along the path of the quilting machine. The invisible thread is great thread, but over time it can be a little abrasive on all of those thread paths. So you want to make sure that it hasn't worn a groove into one of the thread guides. To check that, take a piece of regular thread, pass it through the eye of the guide that you're testing, and slide it around inside the hole of the guide. You're checking to see if there are any scratches or ridges inside. You may be able to buff out a very small scratch with some emery cloth, or worst case scenario, change the guide. They're very inexpensive and available on our online store. For more information about APQS quilting machines, be sure to visit our website at apqs.com. You can also join our conversation on Facebook, find us on Pinterest, and find lots more of tutorials, tips, and videos to help you with your long arm quilting on our APQS quilting channel. Thanks for watching.